This video is sponsored by CyberGhost VPN.
Do not go gentle into that good night.
Do you worry at all that some of this will be misunderstood?
Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
The science was woven into this from the beginning.
Though wise men at their end, no dark is right. Because their words had fought no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night.
It was going to have to really live or die by those things.
It's not possible.
No,
It's necessary.
rage, rage against the dying of the light.
It was 1980. The Iranian hostage crisis was still ongoing. John Lennon would be murdered by the end of the year, and of course, Mount St. Helens would erupt, blasting debris dangerously into the atmosphere. Despite some of the doom and gloom of 1980, theoretical astrophysicist Kip Thorne was getting dressed up in what he described as a baby blue tuxedo. He was on his way to the world premiere of the TV series Cosmos, created by his friend, American astronomer and planetary scientist Carl Sagan.
But no matter how hard you try, you can never gain that last decimal point.
Sagan had called Thorpe up days earlier, inviting him to the premiere, but also asking if he would be interested in a blind date with someone Sagan knew. The Caltech professor would quickly agree to this. At the premiere, he would meet his blind date, Linda Obst, who was a journalist at the time. Thorne would recall, "We really enjoyed each other's company, but the romance just never went anywhere." And though there were no sparks between them, they would keep in touch over the years and both contributed to a 1997 film called Contact. Kip Thorne would go on to be quite the theoretical physicist and writer who would become well known for his work in gravitational physics and astrophysics, as well as his penchant for being able to make heady scientific discoveries exciting and understandable to both academics and laymen. "I got a lot of notoriety early on," Thorne said. "Much of my career, I was just trying to prove I was as good as the world thought I was." After a long career at Caltech, Thorne would begin to set his gaze on a new set of stars, not billions of miles away, but just a few miles to the west of Caltech, Hollywood. Thorne really had his eyes on creating a film, as he said, hard science fiction. There have been far too few films of this type, in which the science is embedded in the fabric of the story. And he had just the story to fill that void he saw, Interstellar. In 2005, Thorne reconnected with Linda Obst, who had moved on from journalism to become a film producer. They would make the initial treatment of what would turn into the film Interstellar, turning a chance meeting decades ago into something that would become larger than either had imagined. Thorne and Obst would work out the theme on Interstellar with a sense of realism in mind, with Obst saying the idea was to explore the universe as it is. It is more interesting to look at what this stuff would actually look like than to make it up.
Kip was one of my very best friends, and I always would hang out with him in Caltech. And we always talked about my movies, and we always talked about his work. And I asked him, what would be the most amazing result to emerge from your work on gravitational waves? If gravitational waves could discover anything, what would you dream that they would discover? And of course, it was a wormhole.
Within a year, their treatment was picked up by Paramount, billed as a story about a group of explorers who travel through a wormhole and into another dimension, with Spielberg aiming for the project's director's chair, doing his homework by visiting a workshop at Caltech alongside Thorne, a number of scientists, and his dad, Arnold, a former engineer. In early 2007, Jonathan Nolan was hired as the project screenwriter, having been inspired to take on the project by childhood space films like Close Encounters, and of course being inspired by Spielberg himself. Luckily, he was able to impress Obst as well, describing his experience pitching the film as a pretty intense experience, but one where they must have liked something. Nolan found inspiration in a theme of endurance, mentioning a desire to confront all the things that are wrong with us and threatening us, but to focus more on hope. After all the research, all the conversations with Kip and Linda, the thing that jumped out was how precious life is in the first place. Jonathan Nolan and Spielberg worked together for 3 years on the script, but in 2009 their collaboration fell through as Spielberg would drop out as the director after Spielberg moved his production company DreamWorks from Paramount to Disney, leaving Paramount without a director for Interstellar for several years. Nolan summed up the situation as, talking story with him, Spielberg, is every bit as exciting and thrilling as you can imagine. The man speaks pure cinema, but like getting a rocket off the launch pad, some things take off and some don't.
We are now leaving Earth's orbit. Please adjust all comms devices to adjust for interstellar travel. For our journey, we have equipped each of your personal terminals and communication devices with our sponsor CyberGhost VPN. Once enabled from the app, CyberGhost transmits your data through a secure encrypted tunnel, giving you a high level of online anonymity and military-grade security for our mission, protecting your online activity, granting you access to geo-restricted content like games, and 40 streaming platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime that will be difficult to access outside of the solar system. Our past astronauts have used this system to great success.
With just one subscription, you can protect up to 7 devices on almost every operating system like Windows, Mac OS, Linux, iOS, and Android. With an excellent Trustpilot rating and over 21,000 user reviews and 38 million current users, CyberGhost is one of the best VPN providers and can help protect you and your data. It only costs $2.03 a month, plus 4 months free. Check out CyberGhost VPN using the link in the description or in the pinned comment below for a special offer just for our viewers.
We are now entering interstellar travel and initiating artificial gravity. Please find your seats.
In 2010, after Spielberg left, Jonathan turned to his brother, Christopher Nolan, for help on Interstellar. Chris, having already been acquainted with the project thanks to what Jonathan called a symbiotic relationship between the two of them, explained, "I always talked to him, so I'd been trying out material with him from the beginning. When you're a writer, you're always looking to see if your scripts pass the jealousy test, like, damn, I wish I was doing that project." I could tell Chris was interested.
We've always benefited from being able to run our material, if it's not something we're working on together, past each other just to get that kind of gut check on where am I going with this thing. And I would talk to him about the ideas behind the film. He was very helpful, but I could tell when we talk about it that there was a little bit of, a little bit with him of, that sounds like a fun project. Sounds like a bunch of ideas that he was interested in as well.
Christopher Nolan told his brother that he'd be willing to take the helm, but it would come with a price. You realize I'm going to rewrite this, right? And so they got to work.
What I was able to do was take the draft of Jonah's script that he got to that had this incredible set of characters, this great situation, and bring some of my own ideas to the table. Things I'd been working on in the science fiction realm for many years. I've kind of fused the things into a project that I thought I could really get my teeth into.
The central premise of a time-traveling quest to solve the gravity problem remained, but the way it was introduced and resolved and the adversaries in between received a sweeping makeover. The draft involved mysterious aliens and a subplot about Chinese astronauts passing through the wormhole and leaving behind a team of robots. Were axed in favor of a new character, the villainous Dr. Mann, and the natural obstacles involved in the explorer's mission, where extra planets were added to complement the draft's original ice world. The time-warping Tesseract was tossed in as a device to resolve the film's final act, leading to the salvation of humanity. In the Spielberg version, it was a gravity-manipulating machine left behind by the Chinese spacefarers. Christopher Nolan said that his changes were essentially a blending of his brother's work and other sci-fi concepts he'd been dreaming up but never revealed to anyone.
I became interested in the idea of artifacts of higher dimensions. The idea that you could view human emotion, particular forms of human connectivity, as not so much, they're not dimensions themselves, but they're artifacts potentially of higher dimensions in which we are spatially, physically, scientifically connected in ways that we can't actually understand.
And although he tried to keep a degree of distance from Spielberg, he did cite Spielberg's influence on the film, aiming for an edgy and incisive family film that he saw in Spielberg's classics, rather than something stuck to the softness normally expected of family films. Something that would be challenging, particularly name-dropping Spielberg's Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, as well as J.J. Abrams' film Super 8, which Spielberg co-produced. Next to the narrative of Interstellar, there is one other major piece that cannot be overlooked: the music.
It was very important to me that the music not pay any attention to the genre of the film.
What? No! Cooper! Cooper, what are you doing?
Before Christopher Nolan would take all of this research and start creating a script, he met up with his old friend Hans Zimmer and told him he was making a film he wanted him to score. The unique part of this is he didn't even tell him what the movie was about or that it was based in science fiction.
I was working on a completely different movie, and Chris said to me, if he were to write one page of something, and he wouldn't tell me what the movie was about, but he'd just write one page, would I give him one day, and just whatever came to my mind, I would start writing.
With some ideas on what his film was supposed to be, together with some snippets of dialogue, Nolan let Zimmer loose to create anything he was capable of without any imposed limitations on genre or what instruments Zimmer was to use.
I sat down and I wrote this piece really about what it feels like to be a father and what it feels like to have a son, and I was writing about my son.
You look after our place for me, right?
When he played me the piece of music, which became the basis for the entire score, I thought it was absolutely perfect and captured the emotional qualities of the film that I wanted.
Interstellar's music features interesting motifs, one of the prominent ones being the use of the church organ. This instrument provided an important element to the film, as while science fiction is in the forefront, it rather is a movie about relationships and humanity. These more irrational elements of the film lie at the core of the narrative, and the organ brings this core into the spotlight by instilling the music with a more religious or mystical vibe.
I also made the case very strongly for some feeling of religiosity to it, even though the film is religious. But that the organ, the architecture of cathedrals and all the rest, they represent mankind's attempt to portray the mystical or the metaphysical.
Instead of just using musical samples or a virtual instrument, it was decided to record a real organ in a church, setting up a microphone array and then capturing it. Capturing not only the performance, but also the authentic reverb of the loud church interiors.
We went to Temple Church in central London and we set up a mobile recording system and spent days in there re-recording the organ.
It took some trial and error, but together with Roger Sayers' talented use of the organ, confidence grew and more experiments were done with this unusual instrument.
There's something very human about it because it can only make a sound with air and it needs to breathe. On each note, you hear the breath. You hear the exhale.
You feel human presence in every sound. And I think that was very important to keeping the film about not just the space that we're looking at, but the people in that space.
While Hans Zimmer was plugging away at the score for this film, scientist Kip Thorne was keeping Christopher Nolan on his toes when it came to the scientific accuracy of the script. Kip Thorne had laid down some rules for Christopher Nolan in writing this screenplay. First, that nothing would violate the established physical laws. And second, that all the wild speculations, and there certainly are some here, would spring from science and not from the fertile mind of a screenwriter. Considering some of Nolan's mind-bending realities in his former movies, Nolan may have finally met his match in Kip Thorne.
I would ask him things that I got from his book about, black holes, the possibility of naked singularities, those kind of things that I wanted to work into the kind of idea of the narrative. And I would put these things to Kip, and he would start arguing with me about them and saying, well, we don't know this, we don't know that. But I got it from your book. This is stuff you wrote.
One example of where he just wouldn't let me go there, said Nolan, I wanted a character to travel faster than the speed of light. And he spent about 2 weeks just beating me down and explaining to me it's absolutely not possible. And I finally had to sort of concede. In the end, both enjoyed working with each other, and Kip Thorne would allow room for the movie to move into being just a movie, as Nolan described it, especially at the end.
I found that kind of objectivity thrilling. I mean, it's what you wish were in every aspect of our civilization.
Being a physicist, working in an area which is much cleaner in terms of being able to determine whether you're right or wrong, it's a very humbling process because every day you believe something and then discover you were wrong.
But even though they would bend a few rules here and there, they really wanted to stick to the scientific possibilities as much as possible, with Nolan saying, I think the audience can feel whether there's a rule set behind what you're doing.
The thing that makes this different is that real science was woven into this film from the beginning and woven in deeply.
scenes, the Nolan brothers developed the project further until Christopher was confirmed as the director in 2012, with the project being officially announced by Paramount in 2013. But while Paramount held the rights to the film, historically, Christopher Nolan had always run his films through Warner Brothers. This time around, Warner Brothers would seek a stake in the film, and according to some reports, they were quite desperate to be part of Interstellar, that they gave Paramount a great deal, agreeing to let Paramount co-finance the next film in the Friday the 13th franchise, and a future South Park movie, and another undetermined Warner IP. This led to some weirdness, of course, surrounding the future South Park series and who had rights to do what, as we can still see today. But what can we say? Warner Brothers really went all out for Nolan. Nolan then set about selecting Matthew McConaughey, as he wanted an everyman to be the lead for the film. As Nolan put it, someone the audience could experience the story with, calling him a phenomenal, charismatic presence.
I mean, at its heart, it's a father-daughter relationship. It's a parent-child relationship, and how do you say goodbye without a guaranteed return ticket for where you're going, which is what happens to my man Cooper.
Nolan became intrigued with McConaughey after seeing him in the film Mud, and approached him with a conversation that McConaughey called not specific. Rather than going into the nitty-gritty of the plot, he had a 3-hour chat with McConaughey about family, maybe partly as a social call, but more likely probing to see how well he could fit the mold for Cooper, and the dynamic between him and Murph, who Nolan recruited Jessica Chastain to play. Anne Hathaway would also be cast as Brand. She was appreciative of Nolan still casting her despite a rough period in her career at the time, to where she had a toxic online presence where people hated her after she won an Oscar in 2013, something many people would dub as Hathahate. Nolan was one of the few directors who didn't care about it and cast her anyway, which Hathaway would credit for keeping the momentum of her career alive, saying, "A lot of people wouldn't give me roles because they were so concerned about how toxic my identity had become online. I had an angel in Christopher Nolan who did not care about that and gave me one of the most beautiful roles I've had in one of the best films that I've been part of." Rounding out the rest of the cast would be longtime Nolan collaborator Michael Caine and a young Timothée Chalamet, with Matt Damon being added in late 2013 as Dr. Mann. Principal photography would start on August 6, 2013, and would last for 4 months, covering multiple locations like Canada and Iceland that we will get into throughout this production section. To start off the production, though, they would begin in Alberta, Canada, a place Christopher Nolan had previously scouted out and found perfect for the vibe he wanted for the film.
A lot of the great westerns were shot outside Calgary. Things like Unforgiven, the first Superman that Dick Donner did, the film was shot there. And one of the reasons is it has these sort of gentle rolling hills and then mountains in the background. So there's a very grand landscape to it. It's really an ideal place to get that kind of beautiful vista that we want.
Now, when it came to the cinematography for Interstellar, Nolan had to move on from his longtime cinematographer Wally Pfister, who was going on to direct his own movie at the time, In Transcendence, and would of course soon after retire from being a cinematographer. This led Christopher Nolan to work with a new cinematographer, and this partnership is significant not just because of the long-standing partnership that they still have to this day, but because they changed what was possible when it came to using one of Christopher Nolan's favorite cinematic tools, IMAX cameras. Interstellar was shot on IMAX 65mm and Panavision 35mm anamorphic.
2001, Stanley Kubrick's great space epic.
Yes.
My dad took me to see that in on the biggest screen in London, and I've always remembered just the size of the screen and the image, and I think it's one of the reasons I wanted to do IMAX films and do a big IMAX space movie. I mean, there's just something about that stuck in my head as suggesting the biggest potential of movies.
And this esteemed format choice led to some difficulties to overcome, such as figuring out how to mount such a massive camera system onto props, or making sure to choose a cinematographer whose back won't snap like a pretzel when hoisting that thing onto their shoulders. Which brings us to Hoyt van Hoytema, who would be chosen as the cinematographer of Interstellar, a man who wields an IMAX camera as if it were Thor's hammer.
People said you could never handhold an IMAX camera. Well,
He certainly proved that is a fallacy.
Regarding how the camera was used, it was mounted onto nearly everything.
Really treating an IMAX camera like a GoPro camera.
While Nolan is expressing himself a little maybe hyperbolically here, the camera really was used to its fullest potential, even being used in ways many wouldn't have expected to be possible at this time.
We didn't treat IMAX in as formal a way on this film as we had in some of the other films. We didn't plot out exactly what sections of the film we would shoot that way. We wanted to just see what emerged by carrying the cameras with us and shooting things that naturally suggested themselves.
This is a stark contrast to the other films that use IMAX cameras for select sequences and can feel a lot like a marketing gimmick to some extent. And even though one could argue Nolan does use IMAX for marketing to great effect.
IMAX, 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 and IMAX, IMAX for IMAX and IMAX.
At least he actually uses the camera and pushes them further than anyone else does. And this film really started the further experimentation with IMAX cameras, transforming what was possible with it in narrative filmmaking. Nolan would speak to this transformation, saying they filmed it like a documentary that I could cut together in 15 different ways. We would just go through the whole sequence and shoot the entire thing using the handheld camera. And to achieve this documentary-like filmmaking of the film with this bulky IMAX camera, Van Hoytema would rebuild the IMAX camera's rigging to be mostly carried around handheld, saying of the reported 45 to 95 pound camera, it's a little heavy, but it's not that bad.
Hoyte was determined to show us that we could handhold the IMAX camera because we'd tried before and never been able to do it. I guess what we'd never tried is what he did, which is just pick the thing up and not worry about how heavy it was. How he did it, I have no idea. He's a very strong guy, clearly. But that freed us up to shoot more of the film in IMAX.
Nolan would also get access to footage from NASA filmed in space with IMAX cameras and review hours of the footage to see how they had filmed it in the realities of space and what that looked like. Nolan was impressed with the footage, especially given the fact that it was close to what they were trying to accomplish in Interstellar, and he would reach out to learn more.
IMAX kept seeing the same name on the films, which was Tony Myers, so Greg at IMAX offered to put us in touch, and we called Tony because we wanted to say how much we'd appreciate our work and how much value we think.
It's so nice. We have to train the astronauts how to use the cameras and light scenes aboard the space station, and they're really good students. I had gone to stay with a friend just to rest for a couple of days, and my cell phone rang at 6 in the morning, and at the other end it said, "Hi, this is Jim Voss. I'm calling from the space station." Well, I dropped the phone. I thought this was somebody playing a joke, but no, it was real. He wanted my advice about how to set up and light a particular scene that he'd been thinking very hard about, and it was not an easy scene to shoot.
The benefit of being able to look at footage of the reality of being in Earth orbit, shot with the cameras on the format that we were then going to use. It's like there's a bunch of IMAX films to look at, and then you get to figure out how to
understand exactly how that would really help.
For this film, Nolan would end up using more IMAX cameras than he had ever used in his previous two films. This was just, of course, the start of Nolan's obsession with IMAX cameras, as we all well know.
IMAX is about delivering an experience that you cannot replicate anywhere else except in an IMAX cinema. And it's best when it's actually filmed with an IMAX camera. Chris is someone who honors that and who forces us to ask those questions of why aren't we doing it this way more frequently.
A pillar of Interstellar's narrative is environmentalism, specifically the fight against the Blight, an ongoing natural disaster which wiped out a lot of the plant life on Earth. While it wasn't really explained what the Blight was exactly, there are parallels to draw between it and the rampant climate change problems we are experiencing in the real world. In the case of Interstellar, the planet is slowly turning into a desert.
I do believe we learn from our mistakes, and I do believe we are intelligent enough to move forward with wisdom, so we won't be in a situation like they are in Interstellar.
I really wanted to try and bring the audience's attention to the idea that not only could it happen like this, it actually already has happened even worse.
Your daughter's generation will be the last to survive on Earth.
The family in the movie revolves around the Coopers, of course, who are farmers and own their own cornfield. Following the father of the family, we observe what our Earth has turned into. While our Earth in reality hasn't yet reached this critical level in environmental issues, of course, everyone on set got a taste of living in an America turned desert. As while the dust storms seen on screen were artificial, they still were very much real, with gigantic fans on set and the crew shoveling sand right into them.
The dust is real dust being thrown at my face. So that, as an actor, it's great to actually have the tangible things to hold on to. So you can just focus on the character's journey and not think about, I'm trying to do this and I'm also pretending there's this set around me.
It didn't take long for an entire set to be overwhelmed with and caked in dust.
It was possible for Scott Fisher and his guys to put dust in the air from using this very safe product. It's used as a filler in food and so forth, but it sits in the air. It really looks like thick dust.
Though in the end there was likely some VFX work done to fill out and enhance the dust in post-production, choosing to incorporate real elements into this helped when it came to lighting.
As soon as the dust is in the air, it completely transforms the lighting environment, how the light reacts. But to do something that actually really looks real and really fits in with the tone of the rest of the film that you're struggling to give some reality to, you really have to do that for real.
To accomplish this, they would utilize massive fans to blow the material into the scene. Christopher Nolan would give his crew the go-ahead to go as crazy as they could to make it a reality.
Chris gives us a lot of leeway to try and get more machines and more material and guys and whatever to cover as big an area as we can. So each spot, we just tried to get as many machines and as much dust in the air as we could.
What also got covered in that dust was the very real and not CG cornfield the Coopers, or rather Christopher Nolan and his team, had grown for the movie. And we all know Christopher Nolan's love of doing anything practical he can, whether that's true or not, of course. After consulting with Zack Snyder on his past farming experience for Man of Steel, the studio decided to just go for it, throw $100,000 at the problem and try to cultivate a cornfield in Western Canada for this movie, which seems like one of the easiest practical elements Nolan's ever pulled off. Just grow corn, right?
We really wanted to get some sense that this corn was being farmed somewhere that it probably shouldn't be.
Well, Nolan's right. It doesn't look a lot like corn should be grown there, and this is where the reality of the film is actually reality in real life.
And indeed, they don't farm a lot of corn where we were farming it in Calgary because the wind out of the mountains can kill it very easily.
There were, in fact, many doubts that the corn could even be successfully grown at this location, let alone in time for the movie.
We went to see the Department of Agriculture, and their opinion was, well, it will probably fail.
So legend has it Christopher Nolan picked up his IMAX camera, plugged it into a telescope, and peered into the depths of a black hole. What he found there was not the love or the formula for gravity Matthew McConaughey's character found in the movie, but a man just crazy enough to plant corn where everyone said you shouldn't.
You grow corn here, you're living on the edge. This would be on the edge of common sense. And at this altitude, it's 4,100 feet right where we're standing. We've never grown corn here. Nobody has, I don't think, anywhere out here.
And this was a vital location for the film. If they couldn't pull it off, there would be massive production headaches and, dare I say, Nolan's nightmare scenario, CGI solutions.
Here, we seated it May 10th. Like July 8th, it was just barely knee high. I said, this ain't gonna work, boys.
But then, in an IMAX level miracle, the corn began to grow.
Strangely enough, corn grows very fast, and by the moment we started shooting, it started reaching the perfect height.
Thankfully, they were able to pull this off, and if we're being honest, having these mountains in the background in this kind of location does give this film an iconic feel to it.
We have 350 acres. At another location, we have another 500 acres. You know, when you look at it and its scale, it's quite huge.
And of course, there is a fun fact that they would not let the corn go to waste here and would sell the corn reportedly for a profit after production. Now that they had that Dust Bowl vibe and the dust storms going off, they would actually bring in something from the real world. Interview clips from the real Dust Bowl.
The influence of Ken Burns' Dust Bowl documentary is profound on the film, and I felt like it would be very valuable thing to look at in terms of agricultural disaster.
That footage comes from a documentary film titled The Dust Bowl, which chronicled the experiences of farmers that have experienced agricultural destruction via dust storms firsthand during the Great Depression. Nolan was moved by the series and proposed to the original creators of The Dust Bowl, Ken Burns and Dayton Duncan, to license portions of the movie to him. Sensing that Nolan was genuinely moved and interested by their work, Burns and Duncan allowed him to use interview clips from their movie following certain conditions. For one, the studio needed to collect the consent of the interview subjects before using any clips, and additionally, Burns and Duncan wanted to read the script and get a feel for how their material was to be used. The inclusion of those clips put the rest of the movie into context. Land turning into dust bowls, leading to destroyed farmlands and even loss of life actually happened in the real world. Interstellar took those real happenings and made them worse for its narrative, of course, turning a localized event into a global crisis. As production would wrap up in Canada, the team would move to Iceland.
We went to Iceland because, having shot sections of Batman Begins, the stuff set in the Himalayas, we knew the terrain very well, and we knew that it offered us a lot of different looks that we hadn't been able to use in that film. It's one of the few places in the world where you can get 2 or 3 very, very different extreme looks.
Iceland is a popular location for any film that needs an alien landscape, an icy desert, which essentially is uninhabitable, with a landscape that feels extraterrestrial. Other sci-fi movies such as Prometheus, which we of course recently covered on the channel, had this location on their travel list. But for Interstellar, they used Iceland in a way that you don't necessarily notice any of those trademark features.
A picture like this, a science fiction picture, you have to go to places that really stamp a kind of reality on the script.
In the story, Iceland is used as both what we call Miller's Planet and Mann's Planet. And Mann's Planet is all ice. I participate in Miller's Planet, which is a planet completely covered in water.
Stepping into the infinite, seeming expanses of water which stretches from horizon to horizon, it can be hard to believe that this is a real place. This Icelandic word I'm not going to try to pronounce. Glacier in Iceland, which is also a popular hiking destination the crew booked out completely.
We went there initially looking for the ice planet. And then we started looking for the water planet because we noticed on the map something that we'd seen years before, which is these great deltas where the water goes across the black volcanic material into the sea.
But it was not as easy to get this location. They would have to pave a road for 15 kilometers and put pipes along the way so they could bring in everything that they needed, including an entire 2-scale spaceship.
The location was perfect, really. Sand underneath the water was very, very firm, allowed us to put our very heavy spaceship out in the middle of it.
With cranes hauling life-size spacecraft and the actors wading through knee-deep water, all shot on IMAX cameras, which of course are difficult to carry, the location was far from easy to film in.
You know, the whole crew had to wear waders and be working in, knee-deep water the whole time, which poses challenges. I think people found it extremely challenging.
It was actually quite dangerous in real life, as the risk of hypothermia setting in was very real, especially if a costume failed, which sadly happened for Anne Hathaway.
Gravity's punishing.
Been floating through space too long? The plan was for me to be airtight in my suit, but unfortunately a zipper didn't get totally closed. So when I went under the water, as per the script, my suit filled up with cold water. It was fine. That was my first day.
For a scene in which her character would be submerged in icy waters, water started rushing into her costume, which she decided to endure for a while as she didn't want to disturb Christopher Nolan. But once her body became numb and tingly and her vision started to blur around the edges, she decided to speak up about it. In the end, it's important to remember that these locations aren't playgrounds. They come with an unmatched beauty, but are also bundled with danger. And what was also bundled with danger was trying to build stunt rigs out in this uncontrolled water, which is an issue the stunt team had to get creative with.
Doyle goes to get in the back of the spaceship, and he's ripped away from the back. We had a mobile stunt rig made that was on the back of an all-terrain vehicle, and the back of it was just a flat platform. So we built a truss rig on the back of this that would give us our point that we would pick him to, and all of the RAM and everything was built into that.
So for the actor, who was already, of course, cold from wading around in glacier water all day, getting shot with water cannons and then dragged through the water, I can't imagine it was a super fun experience for him. For Mann's ice planet, though, they would shoot only a few miles away at the largest glacier in Europe. This massive glacier provided some of the most surreal environments in the film.
Formations to portray the landscape we wanted in a very practical setting, because the glacier there as well that you can actually bring vehicles up onto, you can sort of drive right onto it.
The biggest challenge for this specific part of the film was building sets into the glacier.
We had to build that in, like 20 years of being battered by ice storms. We had to really age it into the glacier. And so that meant digging into the glacier to put the pod in. And then we needed to build the set in.
They would have to deal with some unforeseen challenges as well. Like, for instance, anything that would touch the glacier would make it melt.
You were continually separating your set from where it's supposed to be buried. So every day you have to rebuild it.
For both of these scenes, though, two specific things played major roles: the spaceship and the robots. So let's talk about the robots first. Interstellar got its very own sidekick in artificial intelligence in the form of TARS and Case, robots which are distinctively non-human.
I always referred to TARS and Case as articulated machines rather than robots, because to me the idea of a robot is, a machine that's impersonating a human being.
Where did you get those coordinates? Where's my daughter? Don't make me take you down again.
Interstellar shows robots built for utility. The design is as simple as it can be, essentially just a rectangular robot which can manipulate its limbs in various ways, such as waddling around like a penguin, rotating them to engage in a sprint, and even using some of its limbs to carry people and objects.
My inspiration was it should be a very, very functional piece of equipment. It should be, like a light stand or a tripod or something, or a camera dolly. It should just be a thing. It shouldn't be something that the designers have in any way attempted to make look like something, let alone a person.
TARS and Case would also serve as board computers, integrating themselves into the spaceship the crew commanded. The coolest thing about TARS and Case is that these weirdly charismatic robots were built to be used on set.
When you approach a character who's going to have a computer graphics component, you say, okay, you either do the whole thing CG or you do the whole thing with some kind of build on set.
Initial ideas for implementing a robot in the movie came up in pre-production, where the preferences for a non-human robot was established along the way, and the bots didn't really change much throughout the course of production after DNEG figured out how they were supposed to move around and interact on camera.
So they got stuck with the problem of having to make this whole thing walk and move. It was a difficult piece of puppeteering.
They picked stainless steel. Unfortunately, no way to make stainless steel light. So now the TARS that we had was about 70 pounds heavier. It got up into just a hair under 200 pounds.
This would impact how they would build the cable system they designed to move it around, so they came up with a solution.
So the special effects shop geniuses had created a compressed air system. So now it's like a video game, and that's lifting it and allowing you to manipulate it.
Multiple versions of these robots needed to be built which had different ranges of motion. One which would lift its head out from the board of the console inside the ship, another that just walks around during expeditions, and other models that have articulable arms and even extendable fingers. TARS would also be puppeteered on set with a person essentially attaching themselves to the back of the bot and moving it around. Various walks had to be invented for the bot, as the different environments would make locomotion difficult for different reasons, like walking on slippery rocks or wading through water, which as a knock-on effect made the bot even more believable, as it, similar to people, has to move its legs differently to best traverse certain environments. VFX work would also do heavy lifting here for any scenes involving TARS, as rig removal was necessary and certain moves we see TARS and Case do just couldn't be pulled off practically. Now for designing the spaceship interior, production designer Nathan Crowley explained the challenge of coming up with a design that would fit the dying world and society that they lived in. It took 20 years to build the Endurance in the film. It's a real mishmash of different kinds of technology. You need analog stuff as well as digital stuff. You need backup systems and tangible switches. The story's about leaving paradise because we destroyed it, and we have to go through space in this tin can. Space travel isn't warp 9 please, Mr. Sulu. Otherwise, we would just press a button and the film would be over in 10 minutes. It's about an uphill struggle and figuring problems as you go. While visual effects company DNEG created interstellar backdrops for certain scenes, which we will talk about later on, when it comes to the actual spaceships we see flying through space, they had only little to do with those. For a lot of the shots the models seen weren't created in Maya, nor were they animated in Houdini. They were built for real.
But then when you see the Endurance come into view, that's our 15th scale miniature model.
I think if Christopher Nolan had his choice, he would be shooting in space with real spaceships and actually doing this for real on location, but the next best thing is to use miniature.
New Deal Studios built the space vessels we see in Interstellar.
New Deal were able to build some extraordinary versions of the ships at a huge scale. Almost seems wrong to term them miniatures when they're so big.
And Nolan proved to be a challenging client for the prop makers yet again, as they were hired for various other Christopher Nolan productions, and as is usual for Nolan, he flung various insurmountable seeming challenges into New Deal Studios' way. How about bolting a camera to a miniature to capture it rotating in space? Then there is building scaled down and life-size variants of the same vehicle which have to look the same across the board to make intercutting between the life-size, scaled, and digital be seamless. Of course, we shouldn't let the miniatures and practical shooting keep us from also realizing the amount of visual effects that went into finalizing the look and feel of many of these shots, as well as composites to add various motion-controlled sequences together.
I think we're at a point of visual effects where computer graphics has been around so long that there's nothing new or fresh about it as a technology. So now it sits there as just one of any number of different techniques.
As for any good filmmaker, one does have to come to the realization that every filmmaking technique is a tool. Using those tools correctly or creating new ones to serve your film, like they did with the black hole we will talk about later on in this video, is a key to any great film. And having those tools tied back to the foundational goals of your story and what you're wanting audiences to feel and experience in theaters can lead to great results. And for Interstellar, Nolan wanted those results to be timeless.
What we wanted to try to do with Interstellar was to use techniques that would be timeless, where we would create visual effects shots that will stand up to scrutiny in the future.
To add some physicality and human imperfection into the space scenes, Nolan himself would even pilot the spacecraft with a controller they developed for the full-size ship.
Chris could actually operate in real time with a little kind of steering wheel, I think called a Waldo. And that gave us a real sense of physical reality to the spacecraft that's in the foreground.
Even the explosions of the ship would be made practically as much as possible with the scaled models.
24 frames a second. We're going to be shooting at 72 frames a second. That way we can capture all the action that's taking place, the explosions, the debris, fire, everything else.
There is a moment.
When it came to actually filming the models, Nolan wanted the footage to look more documentary-like, as if a camera was really out there in space capturing all that motion. At the expense of seeing certain imperfections in the image, Nolan believed those imperfections would complete the image and thus wanted the models to be recorded in single passes.
We're shooting it in a high-resolution film format, which is called VistaVision. It's not quite the same size as the IMAX, but it makes a good match for it.
Normally for motion control shots, multiple passes of the same scene are recorded to get certain details in the can, which can be composited together after. A beauty pass, various passes for rim and fill lights, one for high contrast details, maybe even one with fog. Details are recorded separately to be brought together afterwards.
We were getting maybe 4 shots a day if we were lucky out of the model stage, which is working pretty fast.
This approach could have been tricky with Interstellar's model shoots, however, as many scenes ended up being very dynamic, especially with the Endurance moving and turning and casting shadows all over itself.
The lighting conditions on those miniatures would be extremely real.
And also because we're working with really quite low light levels, we need to keep the shutter open on the camera for a lot longer than you would do normally.
And just like any good hard science fiction film about space, nailing the details on the inside of the ship design is equally as important as the exterior design. And what is remarkable about Interstellar's brand of science fiction is that it is rather close to our current technology today. Everything either already exists or is plausible enough to the point where it could be arguably built in the near future, minus Cooper Station, perhaps. This sense of familiarity and the maybe overconfident thought of, we could build this, is in part attributed to the thoughtful design decisions that were undertaken for the visual identity of every spacecraft and rover. Designs were intentionally kept close to current NASA designs and even followed some of the same designs we can observe on vehicles such as the Space Shuttle. Heat shields on the bottom of the craft with lighter materials on the top, the way the windows are constructed, the panel-y look of the Endurance, which could make one think of the International Space Station. Even the spacesuits look plausible enough. Familiar is what you could describe the sets with too, as this design idea carries over to the spaceship interiors.
This is our interior Endurance. This is basically the cockpit.
Everything inside the interior of the ship was built to be functional and efficient, down to adding handles all over the ship, just like they do on the International Space Station.
The ISS is full of handles. How would you move around this space, in 0G, So how would you get from here to there?
These very detailed interior sets allowed for the actors to really lock into their performances.
Walking onto these sets and into these circumstances, it creates, I think, an emotional response. There's nothing cozy on the Endurance. Everything on the spaceship is practical. Everything has a use. It's very utilitarian. You just imagine what that would do to you over years and years and how that would make you a bit weary.
Now, when it came to capturing the zero-gravity situations that space travel brings along with it, intricate interior sets would also be designed for that as well.
Because of the angle and the movement from pod to pod, we needed to put it on a giant hydraulic rocker so we can raise and lower each pod to level so we can shoot it level, and then we will still have perspective through and up to the other pods.
We built basically the rocker that could tip it from 45 degrees each direction.
They plan to use a combination of wires and other methods to produce the floating effects of moving around the ship, but that choreography had to be practiced before the sets were even built.
We had all the sets made as a rehearsal set, which was just a shell of what we were going to have on the day, with all the doubles and all the stunt guys rigging and testing.
Much like with the miniatures, they would use a combination of different tricks to achieve the results. This was an attempt to keep audiences from figuring out the tricks they were using for zero-G. And in using all these different techniques, they were trying to make it not always look the same. This included a device called a parallelogram that they would manually control for close-up shots, something Nolan himself would join in on.
Usually Chris is at the other end because he's kind of in on everything.
I think Chris's theory is that if he wants something to look a certain way and he can do it himself, then it's best for him just to do it.
After finishing shooting on location in Canada and in Iceland, they would wrap up the production in Los Angeles at various studios. And during this time, they would of course film pieces of what you might have thought was a completely green screen or CGI environment when the trippy black hole sequences begin.
Yeah, that's why it was intense, because it was challenging design-wise, and then practically it was challenging. Getting everyone used to the fact that we're going to build some stretched furniture and the room we're going to stretch in XYZ axis. We built, I think, 80 or 100 by 60. It was a big old set.
While CGI would of course be used to substantially fill in the gaps for this part, the intricate wirework and the fascinating panels built for this are something to behold.
Every single interior surface had a projection running on it. So in the last few weeks, I think we had something like maybe 15 projectors running simultaneously. And there were some scenes which are just entirely lit by the projectors. We were using the projectors as a light source.
Principal filming would end in December 2013, and they would move on to post-production and black holes. While Interstellar had a practical first approach, whether it be massive cornfields, dust storms, or even robot props moving around on set, there is no way around visual and digital effects for certain problems. So, however practical Interstellar may seem as a movie, it got a good serving of digital effects to hide some unwanted things on set, provide footage for screen projection sequences, and to create dangerous black holes, gargantuan ocean waves, and four-dimensional tesseracts. Interstellar may be practical first, but it really doesn't put digital and visual effects second.
Instead of visual effects being an afterthought that happens in the post-production process after the movie's wrapped, it was very much part of the heart of the whole filmmaking process right from day one. DNEG,
as we have mentioned, were tasked in working on those effects for the movie, and they had some challenges in the way they needed to work it out, especially when considering the scientific accuracy and working with 65mm IMAX footage. Multiple scientists were discussing the effects of the film, specifically the science advisor and producer Professor Kip Thorne, together with Oliver James, who's the lead scientist for DNEG's research and development department. Together with CG supervisor Eugene von Tunzelmann, scientific accuracy would be ensured, and DNEG would create a bespoke renderer which would visualize the black hole, called the DNGR, which stands for Double Negative General Relativity.
And everybody at Double Negative took Kip's mathematical data and they created real visual representations of what a black hole is meant to look like.
The collaboration has produced visualization of things which nobody had ever managed to do before.
Luckily, of course, DNEG made their research paper on DNGR freely accessible with demonstrational videos as well. The challenge of realistically depicting black holes is getting its gravitational pull right and figuring out how light is bent by the hole's gravitational force. DNEG, of course, made use of general relativity equations, ray tracing, and several other things in order to trace the light beams around the hole, calling the process gravitational lensing. Unlike traditional scientific CG renders, Interstellar's black hole shots also took the lens characteristics of an IMAX camera into account, specifically when it relates to lens flares. how the light is scattered in the lens is simulated in the scene in order for the CG shots to be congruent with the rest of the movie, which is predominantly, of course, shot on IMAX. Interstellar's black hole is surrounded by an accretion disk, which essentially is a field of debris, or in this case, light. A thin accretion disk to construct the black hole wasn't mathematically solved, but rather recreated by an artist at DNEG. The black hole also doesn't show so-called Doppler shifts, as Christopher Nolan wasn't keen on including those in the final effect. Of course, taking some artistic liberties in the depiction of this extraordinary natural phenomenon. The paper goes into many details, but it sadly is a bit difficult to understand what exactly is going on in them, as we are laymen when it comes to astrophysics and computer graphics. It's easy to forget that sometimes that digital art and visual effects require so much technical knowledge and raw power to create, from code optimization to technical considerations, and even scientific research. For a bespoke renderer, technology, problem solving, and smart minds will always be the heart of digital and visual effects. With post-production wrapped up, it was time to release the film. The film would beat IMAX's worldwide opening box office record, hauling in over $20 million in its opening weekend. In critical response from both audiences and critics, the film received mostly warm reviews, with many praising its visuals, while some of course thought it lacked substance, with Forbes writer Scott Mendelson saying that it had a lack of flow, a loss of momentum following the climax, clumsy sound mixing, and thin characters. In fact, this is still something that is hotly debated today, with some loving this film and others hating it. And that has grown somewhat toxic, from those that dislike this movie towards those who actually enjoyed it, like myself. It's always sad to see others dismissing people for liking a film that they don't. But despite the criticism for this film, you have to applaud the stunning visuals, the scientific research, the amazing score for it, and the no cutting corners approach Nolan and Thorpe took to making this film. And if you liked our video on this epic sci-fi adventure, be sure to check out our other video on Christopher Nolan's world of practical effects right here. And don't forget to check out CyberGhost VPN using the link in the description or in the pinned comment below for a special offer just for our viewers.